Welcome to another workshop offered by the University of Kentucky's Office of Work, Life, and Benefits. We are very happy that you have joined us today to talk about this very important topic, emotional eating, why it happens, and how to curb it. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Bryla McNees. She is one of our employees with our health and wellness team. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Great. Thank you, Izetta, for that introduction and for inviting me to be here. And hello to everyone who's in attendance. It's great to have you here. I see a lot of familiar names, so it's nice to cross paths with you again. And I think there's some new folks here as well, and it's nice to meet you. So thank you all for your interest in this topic. I can see from your answer to Izetta's question about why you joined the workshop today. Hopefully, the first thing you notice is that you are not alone. And I think, like one of the participants said, they understand this is a very common experience. And I think that's a good place to start, that you are not alone. Emotional eating is inherent to the human condition, and we all do it, and some of us struggle more than others. And we're going to talk about ways to help with that. Okay. I also saw some comments about stress eating in terms of particular emotions that seem to trigger eating is stress. So we'll talk about that and other emotions. I also saw a comment about the Halloween candy being a little bit of a trigger right now in some offices. So yes, hopefully some of the tips we have today will help with that. But it's always something is my assessment, right? It's always something. Like, right now we're getting into the probably craziest food season, right? You guys understand it's the Halloween candy, and then we're moving into Thanksgiving, and we're moving into the winter holidays and New Year's. And even after that, then what is it? It's the Super Bowl and it's the Valentine's Day. And it just feels like, right? Endless challenges, but we're going to view it as endless opportunities to practice the new strategies that we're going to learn today. How about that? We're going to reframe it a little bit and get you guys equipped. But I know there's never a perfect time, it seems like, to do any of this or practice any of this because there's always something happening. All right. I want to start with this thought. Um, Ellen Satter, she's a registered dietitian. She's been around quite a while. She's written a lot of books on emotional eating. She's also written a lot of books about how to feed children and raise intuitive eaters. Very, very prolific in our field. But I love this quote from her about emotional eating. Emotional eating is only a problem when you abuse it. Feelings go straight to eating with no interpretation. And this is very much going to frame our discussion today. We all will emotionally eat at times, regardless of how much you learn from this presentation today and try to apply the strategies. Okay. It will always happen to some degree. So the goal is not to completely avoid emotional eating. I don't think that's realistic. And it's not necessarily a fun way to live either, to be quite honest. And we'll talk about why. But there is a problem where people say, a lot of the folks in the chat were already saying, like, hey, I know this is like a chronic issue for me. And again, maybe you feel like emotions do go straight to eating. Okay. And that is when it's problematic. Okay. That's when it means we probably have no other strategies or coping mechanisms to kind of break that connection between I feel a feeling and I start eating. Right. And we need to create some pauses and some strategies that can kind of break that cycle where the eating goes or the emotion goes straight to eating. All right. And we need some interpretation. We need a little time for some self-reflection and checking in with ourselves. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today as well. So again, the goal is never to not emotionally eat. Okay. It's to do eat always in an informed and mindful way. And sometimes you might just emotionally eat and decide to do so intentionally, and that's okay. But we need to make sure that we're being intentional and we're interpreting our feelings and checking in with ourselves about what we really want and need to do in that moment. But I think emotional eating feels habitual and automatic for people. Would you guys kind of agree with that? I think that's how a lot of people would describe it. Yeah, like it just feels like automatic. Oh, I feel stressed. I'm all of a sudden at the vending machine buying a candy bar and eating it. Like there's just nothing in between, right? It just feels like two dots you've connected, with a line that just always happen in that way. And that's what we really want to try to break. So there's often a cycle to emotional eating where there is some, and if you look at this as kind of like a clock, I'm going to start at like 11 p.m. there on this circle. So usually there's some kind of specific trigger. Okay, so maybe there is a deadline your boss gave you at work, and all of a sudden you're feeling very stressed and overwhelmed about that, right? So you've got this trigger with the deadline. Now you've got this uncomfortable emotion, this stress, anxiety, overwhelm, right? And so then you can see the next thing is to perhaps soothe yourself with food, which is a common thing many of us will do. And but that often will lead to, at that point, overeating. I think you guys would probably agree that a lot of times with emotional eating, because we're eating in response to emotions and not physical hunger, we're often eating more than we need to of whatever food we've chosen to eat, right? Because we're not eating in response to physical hunger and we're not going to stop when we feel physically full. We're going to be kind of stuffing our emotions, right? And feeding our emotions. And what's the stopping point for that, right? And we tend to eat again, more than we intended to or needed to at that time when we're eating in response to emotions. So there's often that overeating component. And then there's, of course, the resulting guilt and shame that perhaps you feel about having just done that, right? This is the thing, the emotional eating. Oh, I'm always telling myself I need to stop doing this. It's bad. I don't want to do it. And I keep doing it anyway. And you're just beating yourself up, feeling the guilt and shame. All right. And then this cycle just keeps repeating itself. And for some people, honestly, the guilt and shame they feel from emotional eating can be a trigger in and of itself to kick off the cycle all over again, right? It's not like we need to even introduce a novel new trigger into the cycle. Sometimes just the resulting guilt and shame from having already emotionally eaten fuels it all over again. And so it can be very easy, honestly, to kind of stay stuck in a cycle like this. But this is what it looks like for a lot of people. So let's talk about why we do it. Okay. Why do we eat in response to emotions? Now, I think it's helpful to understand this so that you can show yourself some grace, that there are some actually quite compelling reasons why we do this as humans. And that's why you're not alone, right? Like I said, this is part of kind of the human condition in a lot of ways. So I think a lot of us are conditioned or nurtured in a way to eat our feelings. Some of this may have been shaped, in your formative years growing up in your family. Perhaps there were um, maybe a way to cope with negative emotions and situations. Maybe it was modeled that you do eat food, or maybe when you were in discomfort or feeling sad, people offered you food to feel better. And again, this was all very well-meaning. Okay, well intentioned, but for a lot of us, again, in those formative years and when we're learning these habits and connections, this can stick with us into adulthood, right? Where now it's like, oh, okay, every time I feel sad or upset or stressed, I'm going to eat something because we're just conditioned to do that. Not to mention, there are a lot of cultural influences, I think, that reinforce this message. Okay. I know I can think about, for some reason, I always think of the like Dove chocolate commercials. I feel like they have had a theme for quite a while where it's always about like rewarding yourself and all of this kind of thing. And it's very much about, yeah, like the reward, which is part of emotional eating, okay? Like, oh, I got through this stressful, tough day. Now I need to reward myself with food, right? And I feel like, so there's a lot of commercial influences, I think, that just kind of are part of our culture that reinforce this message as well, even if it wasn't part of your upbringing. Food, I mean, luckily for us in a lot of ways, food is, quite easy and accessible. Not that way in every society, but it is here. But that almost makes it more, a little more tricky, right? Because there is food everywhere. Even if you don't bring your own food to work, everyone knows it's pretty easy to find a vending machine or a cafeteria or a cafe or a restaurant on campus and go find something, right? Food is just everywhere. And a lot of times it's fun, and food should be fun. But again, it's just an easy, cheap, accessible way for a lot of people to just kind of feel better in the moment. So that's what we turn to. Many of us just don't know how else to cope. Again, maybe we've just never had the need to build those tools. Maybe again, food has been the only tool we've ever been able to use to cope with our emotions. We just don't have alternatives, and so without that, you just kind of keep relying on food to help you feel better. Stress in and of itself, and again, many of you mentioned stress, and so stress in particular, okay, can actually increase your appetite, like make you feel physically hungry, like you need to eat, and also increase cravings for certain types of foods. So you're not crazy if you think, geez, every time I feel stressed, I want some chocolate. That's actually very science-based, okay? Because stress, as you know, kicks off a whole kind of cascade of hormones. You have, cortisol and adrenaline, things like this that start pumping through your body. And these are hormones that will um, prompt you to eat high calorie dense foods for energy. Okay. And also to eat things that will release endorphins, right? Feel good kind of neurotransmitters in your brain. And so things, high sugar, high fat things like chocolate or ice cream, right? These are the kinds of things we crave when we're stressed. They actually can, like the last bullet says, make us feel better. They actually can help put the brakes very temporarily, okay, on some of those feelings, right? They can give us that quick energy we feel we need when those stress hormones kick in, and they actually can give us those feel good neurotransmitters that emotionally make us feel a little bit better in that moment as well. So again, you are not making it up. It's not in your imagination if you feel like I crave these kinds of things and then actually I do feel a little bit better after I eat them, right? That's very, like I said, scientifically based. But again, these are not, food is not the only thing that can do that in that situation. We have just become accustomed to that. All right. So we do need to find other ways to cope. And we're going to talk about some of those today. Okay. So there are a range of emotions that can trigger eating. It's not, I know most people think of stress, and that's what a lot of you guys mentioned here, but there are a range of emotions, and they're not all bad emotions either. I know we often think of emotional eating as something we do in response to negative emotions, but that's not necessarily true either. So I try to kind of group emotions into categories together. Stress and anxiety, I guess, probably go together in some ways. But boredom or procrastination might be another reason that you eat. I hear a lot of people say this, especially at work, like, oh, maybe you're doing a lot of repetitive tasks at work or just a lot of boring computer work, right? And eating is a way to just kind of have something fun to do while you're doing this very boring task. Or sometimes food is something you do to procrastinate doing a task that you don't want to do. There can also be a level of, again, like we said, the reward, like I talked about with those Dove chocolate commercials. There can also be an element of celebration, right? Like, oh, we're celebrating whatever holiday or birthday, or it's just Friday and I got through the week, I'm celebrating. We can come up with all reasons to celebrate. And also bribery. And I think this mostly probably more from like a parent or a caretaker child perspective, right? That if you are someone who does take care of a younger child, this is something to just be aware of, right? Because I have seen this with my own children. I'm sure I have been guilty of it, but I've seen it with like other adults who interact with my children, say in schools and daycares and things like that, where food is often used as a bribe, like straight up, right? Like, hey, whichever class has the best like behavior points for the week will get a pizza party, or, if you know, use the bathroom how you're supposed to this week. We're going to give you candy, or, all things like that, right? So I think it can be used as a bribe. I guess I understand why it is, but again, I would definitely try to discourage doing that if you're ever in the position of having to decide that. Soothing or comfort, right? So sometimes we just want to feel snuggly and cozy and warm and right, and just have those kind of feel good feelings. Maybe it's a little sadness, something like that. And so soothing and comfort are going to be a big part of why we emotionally eat. Frustration, anger, rage, right? These are a little bit more dramatic emotions, but again, just there's a lot of frustration in everyday life, absolutely. Loving connection. So now we're kind of getting into some things that maybe are a little bit more kind of like positive emotions, but we eat often to connect with people, right? And a lot of our socializing is done around food. This is how we connect with people. That's, why almost every birthday celebration at work involves food because that's something everybody loves and we can all come together around it. People show their love through food, right? Maybe that's why you have that coworker who loves to bake and come and share it with everybody in the office. Like, hey, I made these and I want to share them with you, right? That's how we show our love and affection for people. Going to happy hour after work or going out to lunch with coworkers is a way we can connect with people. So even though we maybe don't have a lot of interest in eating out or drinking after work or whatever, maybe we do it because we just want that connection piece of it too. So there's a lot of that wrapped up in it. Sometimes it's just excitement. Sometimes life can feel kind of dull or boring. I think this was particularly the case during COVID, which was not all that long ago, but I heard a lot of stories of this in 2020 and 2021. Like eating is the only fun thing there is to do. And so people were eating a lot more, eating things they don't usually eat. And that was just a form of excitement. And then finally, release. For some people, and there's a certain personality type that this is related to. People who are very much like to feel in control, right, of different aspects of their life, who maybe are, you might describe them as a little bit more like, type A and that kind of thing, where they're, in control of things all the time. And so sometimes food becomes the one area in life that can be a release and not controlled. And that is a pretty distinct pattern we see with some people, kind of in that personality type. So keeping in mind that sometimes you're trying to keep it all together in every area of life, and maybe food feels like the one thing that like, oh, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to care, I don't have the energy or, whatever to deal with it. And that just, again, can lead to emotional eating as well. Okay, how are we doing so far? Any thoughts, questions on any of this so far? Okay. Okay, so I've kind of broken this discussion up into what to do before emotional eating hits, what to do when it hits, and what to do after. Okay, so that's how we're going to kind of approach this for the next few slides here. All right. What to do before it happens. A lot of these tips are based on how to just prevent emotional eating or minimize the likelihood that you will feel like you want to emotionally eat. Okay. The first one is focus on basic self care. What do I mean by that? All right. Taking care of basic needs. Right. So, are you feeding yourself uh, in a consistent way throughout the day? Right. Not skipping meals because you get too busy and, forget to do it and then get overly hungry later. That obviously can make you more vulnerable to something like emotional eating. So making sure you're fueling yourself with fairly decent nutrient dense foods throughout the day at regular intervals, right? Making sure we're getting sleep. Sleep is a big part of basic self-care. When we are sleep deprived, we become more vulnerable to these emotional influences, right? And how they affect our eating. Focusing on moving your body. Your body is meant to move. Are you moving it, right? Not that you have to be even a hardcore exerciser, but are you just moving your body every day? This is a part of self-care. Are you mentally feeling engaged? Do you feel like you're engaged in meaningful activities? Connecting with people, having meaningful relationships, right? Are you taking time for yourself? Are you having some downtime, right? All of these things that are part of basic self-care. So what the pattern we see is that when these things are not in alignment, you are just generally becoming more susceptible to emotional eating, okay? Because you are likely to have more of those emotions we talked about on another slide, and an easy way to cope is going to be through food. So taking care of your basic physical and emotional needs is a great place to start. Okay? Another great place to start is to avoid overly restrictive diets. Okay. So if you think back to that little emotional eating cycle we saw, okay, that was looking at how emotions can kick off the eating and the overeating and the shame and the guilt. Well, the other thing that kicks that cycle off is being on an overly restrictive diet where you start to feel that you are not able to enjoy foods that you like to eat. You're feeling like, hungry all the time. You're feeling deprived because perhaps you're trying to lose weight or have some other health goal and you're just on this very strict diet. That deprivation can often kick off that emotional eating cycle, but people will often confuse it, right? They'll think that it's emotional eating, but it's really the result of this restrictive diet and like the physical and emotional deprivation you're feeling from not fueling your body properly. Okay. So if you feel like you can't really tell the difference, sometimes maybe it's because, and maybe you're thinking it's emotional eating, but maybe it's just because you're not allowing yourself to have a diet that fuels yourself properly and gives you all the food groups and nutrients that you need throughout the day. All right. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, but we really need to learn to recognize what physical hunger is, because you're going to see that's a very important part of the process when you feel like emotional eating is to check in with yourself and say, is this a physical hunger or is this an emotional hunger? And we're going to look at a couple charts that help you walk through those distinctions. All right. But we really need to know what physical hunger feels like to be able to make that distinction. Okay. We know what a craving feels like of like, ooh, I really want to eat some chocolate right now. But we also need to be able to check in with ourselves and say, are we actually hungry? Is that part of maybe what's driving this desire to eat some chocolate? Or is it purely just emotional? Okay. Because if we find that we are physically hungry, then we need to handle that in a different way. Eating chocolate is not the way to handle feeling physically hungry. That's not going to help you feel full and properly fueled. Okay. Be strategic about the foods you keep around, right? So this is certainly something you could do prior to any emotional eating hitting, all right? Think about at work, think about at home, right? Or the places where you spend most of your time. What foods do you have around? Okay, one, do you have foods around that will be very tempting or overly tempting for you if you are feeling like you want to emotionally eat? And two, do you have other appealing nutrient dense foods available to you that you can eat if you feel like you are physically hungry? Okay. So we want to make sure that we are heavy on the things that are nutrient dense and appealing for when you're physically hungry, but be careful about how much we're keeping around that will be, again, the foods you're going to tend to want if you're emotionally eating. Now, I'm not saying that you want to keep all those kinds of emotional eating foods out of the house. Okay. What did we talk about? Chocolate, ice cream. What else do you guys like to eat when you're emotionally eating? Chips. Um, those are probably the big ones. High sugar, high fat things, high carb things usually, maybe salty things sometimes. Yeah, there's Pa Susan. Yeah, crunchy, salty things are a big one of any kind. Sometimes it's nuts or popcorn, which are fairly nutrient dense. But again, emotional eating isn't just about the type of food you're eating. Just because you're eating ice cream doesn't make it emotional eating. It's because you're eating in reaction to emotions. You could still be eating something healthy like carrots and hummus in response to emotions, although that's probably unlikely. But that's still emotional eating, right? If you're not physically hungry and you're eating it for some other reason. So again, I'm not trying to say we only eat, these less nutrient dense foods when we're emotionally eating, but they're often a hallmark of it for sure. Yeah, Halloween candy, chips, yeah, bread and crackers, right? There's the carbs. Again, a lot of the things that are going to just help us relieve that stress and make us feel better by releasing some of those feel good neurotransmitters in our brain. Absolutely. But you do want to be strategic about what you keep around. I'm not saying don't keep any chocolate or treats or chips or ice cream around, but be smart about it, right? Everyone knows maybe there's some things that are best kept at the grocery store or not in your pantry, right? That are just too tempting or you feel like a little unsure about keeping around. Maybe if you really want ice cream once in a while, you go out and get a scoop of it somewhere, and enjoy that. Or you buy, one donut at the store instead of the pack of 12, right? Being smart about when you indulge, how you indulge in those kinds of foods. And watching again the quantities of those things you keep around as well. I often find it's real effective too to keep things out of sight that you don't want to always be prompted to eat. Maybe you guys already use that strategy, but like keeping the ice cream in the back of the freezer, I keep my candy in like the deep dark recess of the pantry where it's not the first thing I see when I open up the pantry, right? And it's amazing. Sometimes I've actually forgotten about things that I hid from myself in a way because I wasn't seeing them regularly, and I'm like, oh, look at this Christmas candy from 3 months ago I put in this random place. So, there's a strategy too to like, if you have those kinds of things around, making sure they're not the first thing you're going to see when you walk in the kitchen. And then finally, plan for non-food ways to distract or soothe yourself. And we are going to walk through what some of those things could look like. But the point of this is to plan ahead of time. You cannot come up with effective, creative ways to distract or soothe yourself when you're in the throes of that emotion. That is not the time to be trying to do creative problem solving, okay? Your brain is not going to do a good job of it like that. So you need to think about this when you are calm, right? And not feeling those emotions. And again, we're going to show you some ways to do that. Yeah, and that's always, is that right? I appreciate you saying that. I mean, always something to try. Like when you feel like you want to emotionally eat and the urge to eat something is just maybe too overwhelming, maybe start with something that is a little healthier that you think could be satisfying, right? Like, well, I want something crunchy and salty. Maybe instead of chips, I'll have a few nuts. That's a little healthier. Or the popcorn, for example, right? Or maybe I'll have a sweetened yogurt or a little dried fruit instead of candy, right? So certainly that's worth experimenting with. I will also make the point, though, that that doesn't always do the trick. Sometimes a craving is just a craving, whether it's related to emotional eating or not, right? We all get cravings, even if it's not emotionally based, right? And so recognizing that sometimes we try to eat around a craving and then still end up eating the thing we wanted originally anyway. So you do kind of need to try to be as kind of honest with yourself as possible when it's like, no, I just really need like some real chocolate right now. And you're going to be intentional about eating it. That's fine. But at least you've, again, thought through it and it's not just a habitual or automatic type of decision. Okay. So what do we do when the emotion hits, right? We're in that part of that emotional eating cycle where it's like, oh, we've got this uncomfortable emotion and the arrow is now pointing to eating. What is it that we do in that space to kind of slow the roll a little bit? All right. My first suggestion is to try something called delay, distract, decide. This is actually what they call like a cognitive behavioral therapy strategy. They use it in a lot of things, maybe like drug recovery and things like that. Things of just maladaptive behaviors that people don't want to be doing but find difficult to stop doing. And emotional eating is one of those things, right? So this is based in that idea. The idea is that you want to create some space. And that's what I talked about at the very beginning. We need space between having that uncomfortable emotion and making the decision to eat. This is the space we're creating. All right. So this is where delay, distract, decide comes in. You say to yourself, okay, I've got this emotion. I'm feeling something. I think it's prompting me to want to eat. That's my first instinct. Let me stop and pause. Let me not make a decision about whether or not I'm going to eat or what I'm going to eat for at least 10 minutes, say. You can make it longer if you want, but usually 10 minutes is a good place to start, right? I'm going to delay just making a decision. Now, during that delay, you're probably going to want to distract yourself with a non food activity. Try not to distract yourself in the kitchen, maybe go to another part of the house or whatever. But and maybe this is where you could brainstorm ahead of time a list of some things you could do to distract yourself, right? Maybe you're like, oh, I'm going to go answer a few emails, or I'm going to go text my friend, or play this game on my phone a few minutes, or go play with the dogs, or whatever it is, okay? But come up with a few ideas that you can turn to in that moment of how you're going to distract yourself. And then after 10 minutes, come back to it. And I know this sounds maybe overly simplistic, and maybe some of you are thinking, like, really? Like, what is this going to do? It's actually quite powerful. Okay. And if you practice with it, I think you will find that. Now, this delay, distract, decide doesn't mean you're always going to decide not to eat something. And again, that's not the point of this exercise. The point of this exercise is to create some space, help yourself calm down from like the hot emotion that's happening. Okay. Because that's really what this is. If you think about, I'm not a brain expert, right? I know enough of how it affects food and eating and emotions, but your your emotions, we call that like the hot part of your brain, right? It's like the emotional, not as rational part of your brain, right? And what we need is time for that to kind of chill out and be able to get, tap into the more, problem solving, rational part of your brain, right? They're different parts of your brain. And so we need the hot system to cool down and let the cool system, come into play, right? That's really what this space is doing. That is what this 10 minutes is doing, allowing you to do that. And if you think about emotions, think about how they feel. They feel very hot in the moment, right? They burn bright, but like they often flame out in a pretty short period of time, right? So letting it calm down. Maybe it doesn't calm down. Maybe you're like, no, I still really feel this way. And I just really feel like I want to eat some chocolate right now. Okay. It was at least now it's an intentional decision. You've thought through it. You've given yourself that chance to calm down and make a more rational, logical decision. Okay. When you are deciding what you're going to do at the end of this delay, these are the things you want to ask yourself. Okay. And we're going to look at these each a little bit more in detail. Am I physically hungry? Because, like I said, a lot of times we are actually physically hungry while we're also having an emotion. And so we want to be sure we're taking care of the physical hunger first in the right way. But we'll talk about that. What am I feeling? So we're going to talk about trying to get as specific as we can about what our feelings are, because that's going to inform us about how we respond to them. Okay, now I've identified my feeling. What is it that I need? What is it that would soothe me in this moment, right? And make me feel better? That is not food, right? And we're going to look at that as well. Okay, so the first step there was right. Am I hungry? This is a great chart that I think sums up physical hunger versus emotional hunger. And that's, remember that early on I said we got to know what physical hunger feels like to help make this distinction. But there's some hallmarks of emotional hunger. One of them is that it comes on very urgently and suddenly. Like I just said, that's what emotions do. They're hot, right? They often come on very suddenly, okay? Um, Often it's a thought that you can't get out of your head, okay? Um, Only specific comfort foods will satisfy you, right? So you get very fixated on specific types of foods, like maybe some of these things you guys have mentioned. And you don't really feel satisfied until you're often uncomfortably full. And I talked about that too, right? Because you're not eating in response to a physical hunger. You're going to eat until you're just like kind of maybe emotionally numb or your emotions are kind of stuffed down, right? And you soothe yourself with the food. So those are some hallmarks. Physical hunger, on the other hand, right, should develop fairly gradually, right, based on kind of when you last ate something. You often feel it in your stomach, right, as a physical sensation of your stomach growling. Maybe you start to feel a little bit also like you can't focus or pay attention as well. Maybe you start to feel a little like low energy. Um, Physical hunger is going to be open to lots of different foods. To me, this is one of the easiest ways to tell if it's physical hunger or emotional hunger, right? Because if you're physically hungry, you're not going to be quite as picky about what food it is that you eat. You just need fuel. Whereas the emotional hunger, right, you are going to be very attracted to those high sugar, high salt, high fat type foods that we talked about. Okay. And physical hunger, generally speaking, you're going to stop eating once your stomach feels full, right? And you feel physically satisfied. So I hope that this is a helpful chart to help you make some of those distinctions. I will also add another thing. I would say that also a really great hallmark of emotional hunger to pay attention to is, do you feel that guilt or shame afterwards? Right? Remember we saw that on the emotional eating cycle? That's the thing that follows. That generally should not follow with physical hunger, right? I mean, do you feel we shouldn't really, and most people don't generally feel guilty about like, oh, I ate dinner because I was hungry, right? That's just normal. Like I was hungry and I needed to eat. That's what you do. There's not usually guilt or shame associated with something like that, right? But emotional hunger there is. So that even if you can't tell in the moment it's emotional hunger, I think reflecting on how you feel after might be informative. Okay, so here's a nice little feelings wheel to help you really hone in on how you're feeling. Now, remember, Azetta said she's going to send these PDFs out. I think they might be a little bit hard to see some of this really small print here on your screen as I'm sharing it, but Azetta's going to get this to you guys. Um, but I like this wheel because it really does help you name your feelings. And that can be very important, like I said, for the next step of how we're going to make ourselves feel better. How you might make yourself feel better if you're sad versus, angry might be two different things, right? So we want to get as specific as we can. Now, this wheel is kind of divided up into six sections. So there's like a core part, and you've got six emotions here: surprise, happy, sad, disgust, anger, fear. Okay. And then they kind of branch out from there and they get a little bit more specific. And then the outside circle is physical manifestations of how those emotions might feel, right? So, an example here, you're feeling, um, let's see, what's a good one? You're feeling mad. Maybe your face is flushed. Maybe your heart is racing. Okay. Maybe you are feeling anxious. You're doing a lot of foot tapping or fidgeting. Maybe you're scared and so you're trembling a little. But there's a lot of physical manifestations of our feelings, and we need to use those as clues as to what we're feeling or the fact that we're feeling anything at all. I think a lot of us, it's very easy to just ignore that we're having any feelings, right? Like we're just oftentimes in a day so focused on getting from one task to the next and getting through the to-do list. And sometimes we're not even aware that we're having a feeling, right? Because we're just so tuned into other things and not tuned inward. So some of these physical sensations can be good clues of like, hey, something's going on here. Like, why do I have butterflies in my stomach? Why does my gut kind of have that like sinking feeling? Like, what's going on here? Why is my heart racing? Right? Why do I have a headache? All of these things might be clues of emotion. So sometimes you might start at the outside of the circle, right? Of like, oh, I've got this physical feeling, what does that mean? And maybe you go inward into the wheel, right? Instead of starting in the wheel and then working out towards the physical sensations. It could work either way. Okay. But the idea is that we want to get as specific as we can here, because then that's going to answer this question. What do I need to what do I need? What do I need in this moment, right? Of feeling this to help me feel better? Something that is not food, right? Now, this is just a framework to get you started. These are kind of four categories of strategies you could think about. There's distraction, and maybe that can help you during that delay distract side exercise. There's support. Maybe you need that. Maybe there's a place for confronting your feelings and really sitting with them and exploring them. And maybe there's, self-care types of things that you could do. But these are kind of four buckets of strategies that you could brainstorm yourself. Now, under each one of those, I've just put in like my own ideas or whatever about what some of those things might look like. But this is not an exhaustive list. There are many ways to distract yourself, get support, confront your feelings, do self-care. You can think of your own, but this is just a way to get you started. And something, again, you might want to create now before these situations hit so that you can refer to them and have something to turn to in those moments. You guys have some of your own strategies you like to use? Do you find that there are certain non-food strategies that help you in these moments? Cheryl, thanks for saying that. I'm glad this is helpful. Talk to yourself. That's kind of doing two things. You're like supporting yourself and confronting your feelings at the same time, probably. I like that. That's a good one. Confronting feelings is not easy. It can be hard to be real honest with yourself about what am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? That can get pretty tricky, and that can be hard to do, and that might not always be the thing that you do. Sometimes it's just easier to distract and not think about it in that moment, and that's okay. But if you have like recurring feelings that come up, maybe that's a sign that you need to confront them at some point. You know what I mean? Like maybe there's something deeper going on we really need to explore here. Oh, play music, dance, love that. Making myself slow down. Yeah. I'm a big believer in like a big deep breath, even if I can't do anything else. A big deep breath. Um, I feel like I've learned a lot of these strategies having children. Managing these emotions and not doing or saying something I'm going to regret. Like emotional eating is just one manifestation of emotions, right? But another manifestation is like snapping and saying something you don't really mean in the moment and regret afterwards and things like that. And it's all practicing with the same parts of your brain and the same idea. But I've become accustomed to taking a big deep breath before I say anything when my children perhaps really annoy me or I don't know what else to say, right? Oh, let's see. Susan, I tell myself if I'm still hungry in 20 minutes, I can eat something. Right. So thank you for pointing that out. I kind of left that a little bit blank there. But like at the end of the 10 or 20 minutes, right, where you've done delay, distract, decide. Yes, the point is if you are physically hungry and you've identified that that's what you are, then start with that. Start with eating something that's fairly nutrient dense, maybe got some protein, some fiber, something that can help you feel full, and do that first. Right. I know, easier said than done. But yeah, if you've identified, no, I'm actually physically hungry. Okay, now I need to eat some like real food. Do that first. And then see, maybe the emotional part disappears with that. Maybe the emotional part still hangs around and then you deal with that separately. But you got to take care of the physical hunger first before you can deal with the emotional part. Yeah. Oh, art therapy, something new to you, coloring classes. Oh yeah, those adult like coloring books and mandala kind of things and all that. Very popular. That's an excellent way to distract yourself. And apparently there are a lot of benefits aside just from distraction from doing those things. Cool. Okay. Well, good. You guys got some good things going for you already. So finally, what to do after it happens. Okay, now you're probably thinking, well, what's the point of that? It's already happened. No, it does not stop there. Okay. You want to respond. Again, this is one of those easier said than done things. You want to try to respond with self compassion. Remember what we've been saying. You are not alone in this. Everybody struggles with this. The goal is not to eliminate emotional eating, but it's to minimize emotional eating. Okay. So that, part of self compassion is setting realistic expectations from yourself. Part of self compassion is understanding you're not alone. This is part of the human experience. The other part of self compassion is understanding that, you know, we do better when we are kind to ourselves after a setback. Okay. So, say you do emotionally eat, right? And you start to feel that guilt and shame afterwards. This is where self compassion can be very helpful. Okay. I'm going to describe one study that I read that I think is really instructive about what I mean here. Okay. So, one study they did was they had like two groups of women and they were each in like separate rooms, right? And the researchers, brought I don't know, like a bunch of like donuts and candy and stuff like that into both rooms, right? And they brought these things into the rooms and told the women, okay, eat, hang out here, eat whatever of this you want. Okay. So then they come back after a time and take those foods away, and to one group of women, they give them like notes of like self-compassion and encouragement, right? So they give them like notes that say like, you know, you're enough and keep going and keep trying and you're human. Mistakes are part of life, all these kinds of things. And the other group of women didn't get those messages. Then they bring back more food, more of the not so healthy food, right? And they say, okay, have whatever you want. Well, what they found was the women who got the notes of self-compassion in between the two instances of those foods being served to them, the women who got the notes of self-compassion ate significantly less when the food was presented to them the second time. The women who did not get the messages ate just as much or more of those foods when they were served again. Okay. So I think hopefully you're seeing the point here that, like, that was an artificial situation where these notes were given to these women, but you can do the same thing for yourself. And it's very powerful because once these women, I think what these notes do and what this self compassion does is snap you out of that shame and guilt spiral, right? And so they were able to be reminded, like, oh, yeah, it's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. No big deal, right? And like shift the mindset and not continue with the emotional eating once they had the opportunity to do it. Okay. That's how powerful it is. And that's just one example. So, again, as much as you can show yourself some grace, maybe you make your own little affirmation, self-compassion, note cards or something you can look at for yourself or read some inspirational quotes that you like, but something to snap you out of that cycle that so many of us fall into, right? With the guilt and the shame after. The sooner you can cut that off, the sooner you can kind of show yourself that kindness and forgiveness and move on, the better off you're going to be. Okay. Because by beating yourself up and being in that kind of like guilt, shame mind frame, you're just going to continue being more susceptible to the emotional eating as you go along. You got to use this as a learning opportunity. That's always what I say, right? That anything in life that doesn't go your way. So even if you do the emotional eating, and again, the biggest shame is not learning something from it. If it's going to happen, at least, and you're going to view it as like, oh, that's a mistake. I wish I didn't do that. At least learn something from it, right? And self-compassion is something that can help you do that, right? You can't be learning from mistakes if you're just drowning in, you know, guilt and shame about it. Okay. That's not where learning happens. And then finally, and I know this sounds weird, but there is a gift in emotional eating. It's usually telling us something's up, something needs our attention, right? The eating is just like a manifestation of that. But if we again do the things I talked about today, and create that space for reflection and introspection and mindfulness, we understand like what's going on with ourselves better. We understand what these emotions mean, what these physical sensation means, and we may, when we can learn a lot more about ourselves and maybe treat these emotions in a way where they don't become more troublesome in the future because they're getting the attention that they deserve. And we're again treating them in ways that will actually help instead of with just food. Because honestly, food is just the band-aid. It's the quick fix, all right? But it's not fixing anything long term. But the strategies we talked about today can help with dealing with some uncomfortable emotions long term. Lexi's got a quote. You will get farther in 1 week paying close, non judgmental attention to the unmet needs underlying your bad behavior than you will in a year of punishing yourself and demanding you become a different person. I'm right, shut up. I love that. That's exactly what I'm speaking to, Lexi. Thank you for sharing that. Awesome. Okay, so here we are. This is the final slide. I do appreciate you guys being here. I appreciate your comments and questions so far in the chat, but I am certainly happy to entertain any other questions or comments you might have. Oh, thanks for the little emojis, guys. Appreciate it.